All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. So last week, I talked about my issues with critical scholarship and did a more in-depth breakdown of how I am somewhat critical of the methodological techniques employed by a lot of New Testament scholarship and the places that it leads to. And my overall critique was that they often stretch methodology beyond what it can actually say and come to conclusions that I don't think are actually properly methodologically appropriate for the data that they have available. And I thought it would be good to give a specific example of that and break down in detail how this works and why there are issues with this, because a lot of people in my audience come to me with a lot of questions, and they will have questions of a really specific technical nature about things they read in New Testament studies. And I often have to sit them down and go through really long, detailed explanations about methodological reconstruction, forensic reconstruction, and all those types of things. And I just thought it would be useful to go through a very specific example. So the example we're going to use this week is Paul's letters. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Paul has 13 letters in the New Testament that are attributed to him. Of those letters, 7 of them are generally speaking not disputed by New Testament scholars as authentic. The remaining 6 of those letters are various states of disputation within New Testament studies. So there are letters called the disputed letters, and then there are the pastoral epistles. So pastoral epistles are 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Those ones are generally considered non-Pauline by critical scholars. Again, depends who you survey, but that's basically where it is. So the arguments for why the disputed letters aren't written by Paul or the pastorals aren't written by Paul have 4 components. The first component is the one that we're going to be addressing in detail here today. So the first argument is that there are stylistic differences, meaning that there are sentences, structures, word usages, linguistic symbols, and relationships between these linguistic symbols and words that are different in the undisputed letters than in the disputed letters. And because there are different styles, this means that there are potentially 2 different audiences. So this is a field called stylometric analysis, or I'm going to call it Stylo from now on, because that's just the name we typically use in the field. And it is basically a short form for statistical methods and statistical analytics used to analyze texts. So that's the first argument, and the one we're going to spend most of the time addressing here. The second argument is that in the letters, there are different assumed contexts. The third argument is that in the letters that are supposedly not Pauline, there are references to later developments in the church. And then the fourth argument is that in some of our canon lists that we have from the early church, there are exclusions of some of these letters from those canon lists. And they aren't all in agreement on which letters should be in the canon. And the argument is basically all 4 of these things combined lead us to believe that some of these letters of Paul are not authentic. And I do not think this is a particularly methodologically rigorous argument or a particularly good argument that would allow you to forensically authenticate or attribute letters to a person. And I'm going to break down why. So to help me break down why, I have Josiah Leinbach with me, and I'll just let him introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. As you said, my name is Josiah Leinbach. I am a graduate student in applied statistics at Bowling Green State University, also doing graduate work in economics. But my undergraduate study was history, and especially did a lot of New Testament history. So this sort of subject has always been something on my radar. And then moving into graduate school, decided to pursue it with a lot more statistical rigor, where I had on the New Testament scholarship side of the equation. And so wrote a master's thesis using some hidden Markov models to look at the style of the pastoral epistles specifically, with a couple different training methods and methodology used on the undisputed letters as a contrast, plus some control books like Hebrews and 1 John. So I'm really excited to get into this.
Yeah, so for those of you who have tuned into previous episodes, expecting a non-technical explanation of this. We might get pretty technical in this. We might get into the weeds. So for those of you who are longing for a detailed explanation of technical specifics, you're going to find that here. For those of you who don't understand, you can send me an email and I'll try to explain it in non-technical terms. So I want to be pretty clear here. I think both of us are really qualified to make this assessment. We both have the relevant backgrounds to talk about the actual methodologies employed here because we both have training to do that. I find in New Testament scholarship, you basically have one of two options. You either really understand New Testament scholarship and don't understand the mathematical, computational, statistical side of things, or you really understand the mathematical, computational, statistical side of things and don't understand New Testament scholarship very well. And to make claims about stylistic arguments within Paul, you actually need both simultaneously. And that's a pretty rare combination. And whenever I found people who have that combination, they pretty much come to the same conclusions that I have come to. And so I think it is important that we have people like that actually weigh in on this, because in order to effectively make arguments about style, you have to be able to do computational things. You have to be able to do mathematical things and statistical modeling. And without that, you simply can't do it. And you can't do it very well. And you can't do it in the way that you should. So I have personally not done a huge deep dive into Paul's letters. I have basically spent a weekend with a Jupyter notebook and a few evenings just bashing data through this, going through all my previous experience using stylometric analysis. So I've been using this to some degree for the past 8 years to solve various problems, mostly related to attribution. Attribution is like trying to find out who wrote something. And so this analysis that I've done is I've done the rough analysis. Josiah has actually done the detailed specific analysis of this problem specifically. And so combined, we are going to mind meld and try to explain this.
I think to give people some context about the sorts of things that will be deficiencies when you're talking about someone who's approaching this problem with either really good math, but not great New Testament scholarship or vice versa. One of the papers that I encountered when I was writing my thesis was written by a statistician. And so it wasn't like he was trying to make some grand overall point about Pauline authorship. This just happened to be a math problem that he was applying some methods to. And he made these claims about style and how the various books were being classified by authorship. And you would think that what you would ask yourself when you're reading this is, well, man, he must really have gotten his hands on some good Greek text to do what he's doing here, given some of the claims that he's making. And then turns out he was actually just using an English translation of the Bible to make all of these claims. Now, and the King James at that. So reading this paper, it was fantastic math and the various clustering algorithms he was using, but that can't tell you anything if you're using the King James translation, other than perhaps what was in the mind and the translation philosophy of some 17th century English translators. And then, and as one other example of the same thing, you had a guy who, in a paper that I read, did the same sort of problem. It was unclear whether he used Greek or English. And that was the other thing, is I couldn't often find people who would clearly state what they were using, if they were using an English translation or if they were using Greek. In fact, I encountered somebody who was interested in my topic and then got a hold of me and said, hey, I'm using the King James. And I'm going, okay, so the people keep not seeing that even the most basic thing, you need to use the Greek text. But this guy just lumped in books of all different kinds of genres and was trying to compare Luke with Romans. And that's beyond authorship difference. You have genre differences that you can't control for when you start doing things like that. So on the statistic side of things, there's definitely a subpar knowledge of New Testament studies. And then for sure on the New Testament study side, you have a subpar knowledge of math. And I've generally found at least those who are writing on the side of New Testament scholarship, if they're doing this, oftentimes they're employing these mathematical arguments pretty skeptically and saying that maybe this doesn't even work, but here's some numbers regardless. And then the people on the math side tend to do the same about New Testament studies.
Yeah, so the stuff I've encountered a lot in the New Testament studies is basically, here's a theoretical argument that I think works, where they're like, mathematically, if we measure frequency of sentence length or of word usage or specific things like that, and then compare these models. And a lot of times I read the New Testament studies guys trying to apply mathematical techniques and go, oh, you obviously have not done this in the real world. Like, you obviously have never actually applied these models to a larger data set to determine whether or not they would work. Like, you haven't done your false positive, false negative validation or your methodological assessment of, does this technique actually work at all? And various people communicate their certainty of these models in various different ways. I find often popularizers of New Testament studies blow this argument way out of proportion, like way more than you actually find in the New Testament studies papers themselves. They will like really hammer these stylistic differences are really significant, and don't quite understand that these models don't actually do what they think they're going to do. And like, I've read a bunch of their proposed models and just thought, okay, let's apply these to any other set of letters and just see if they work. And most of the time they have a false positive, false negative ratio that is sometimes worse than guessing. If you just randomly said he did write it or he didn't write it, that would actually be a better method than using some of the proposed methods that they have there. But most people don't know that, right? So there's a rhetorical technique I call math fascination, where if you just throw numbers at people and statistics and big sounding words that sound very smart, or things where you're like, oh yeah, hidden Markov models, I've heard that term before. That sounds like something a smart person would do. They get convinced by it, right? Because they don't have the ability to actually evaluate these arguments. However, I think both me and Josiah have the background and technical expertise to actually assess these models. And we're just going to go through that basically. So before we start, I think it's important to talk about style and what style is, and stylometric analysis. So I'm going to try to give a brief overview, and I'll let you interject, Josiah, whenever you want. Style, as I have defined it for lay audiences, is a mathematically expressible pattern determined through statistical relationships between words given a grammar. When you are looking at what style is, that is the easiest way I can define it. Stylometric analysis is not bound to one language. So the techniques and the ideas that you use in stylometric analysis are language agnostic, just as long as you properly model the grammar of whatever new language you're applying it to. So the techniques that work on English will work on Greek, just as long as you properly adapt to the grammar of Greek from the grammar of English. Style is basically a statistical relationship between linguistic symbols. So the way that you detect style in your brain, like when you read things that are different and you think this is a different style, what you're basically doing is primitive pattern analysis, where you're saying, okay, the word I just read here, what's the chances that the next word is going to be X or Y? And that's essentially what your brain is doing without you recognizing it. And you're basically just doing pattern recognition, which is really good, because one thing computers are great at is pattern recognition and statistical analysis, and doing these things really quickly, really accurately, and really efficiently. And so style isn't actually subjective. Style is, I think, one of the more objective metrics that you can use for text analysis when you're talking specifically about style as I've defined it. I know for sure. So the languages I've used this on are French, English, Arabic, Mandarin, and then Wingdings. So for my graduate courses, when I was teaching them, just so that they couldn't cheat on the assignment, basically, I created a whole new grammar and language and wrote it entirely in Wingdings, and then just got them to apply these methods using the grammar that I laid out and Wingdings. And so you don't actually need to be able to read anything. Like, the words don't actually have to have meaning, just as long as you have a coherent grammar. You can apply these methods.
Yeah, that's especially your point regarding the different kinds of grammars that go on across languages. That's something that people can get tripped up on when they think about style, because they might not realize how certain grammatical features in one language might be really indicative of some style change, or very highly sensitive, but in other languages they might be less so, just because of the grammar that goes on. And in particular with Greek, the fact that word order is very fluid because it's a declined language is something that it constrains possibilities, but also opens others. And that's why with my particular analysis, I used parts of speech transitions, because in Greek, word order is far more fluid than in English because of declensions at the ends of words. And so whereas in English, you might have a more fixed word order where parts of speech will be their transitions from one to another as categories will be kind of more invariant across styles in English. They'll be, my theory, and it was largely borne out by the evidence, was that it will be much more variable in Greek because it's fluid. Then that sort of change will be more indicative of a change in style. But yeah, you have to really be careful about what grammatical features you hone in on, because they will vary from language to language, if only in the sensitivity to which they respond to stylistic or authorial changes.
Yeah, and so there are a few other points that we need to make about style that might not be obvious to people who don't do this analysis or think about this analysis. So style isn't uniform throughout a person's writing. Style throughout a normal person's writing will change as they are writing, depending on basically how they're thinking about a text. There are many occasions in which style will change, and so they don't really have a style, but they actually have a combination of several styles all in one. So you could think of their overall style as like a specific flowing combination of several subsets of style. But I just want to make it clear that when we say style, we aren't talking about one solid uniform thing that goes throughout a text. We're talking about lots of different things.
Yeah, and one last thing on that. Style is also highly subject matter dependent, depending on what you happen to be writing on within the course of a given letter or monograph, what it may be. Because not only will vocabulary change, and vocabulary especially is highly dependent upon subject matter, very sensitive to it. But even leaving out the question of just raw vocabulary, if you're reading through a book of some sort, maybe a popular but kind of academic-ish level book, you might get an opening chapter that's trying to relate some stories and it's more narrative based. That will necessarily have a different style than chapter 2 when they start to try and get into more technical subjects. So you can see changes in style pivot across a page within a book written by the same author. And those are the sorts of things that don't even bring into account what if you have two authors who are co-authoring a book. What does one write one chapter and another write another chapter? Are they editing each other's work as they go? Those are the sorts of things that are confounding factors that if you just speak with too much certainty and don't account for, you'll really be overstating your case.
Yes, and we'll get into later on all the sorts of things that we know change style based on just analysis of current writings and things like that that I've done analysis on. But these things are very variable is what I want to get across. And there's also another important point, which is that style changes based on how you analyze things at levels of abstraction. So they're in statistics, and specifically like information theory and entropy calculation, you do something called n-gram analysis, which means analyzing like things in groups and clusters together. And depending on what level you're looking at the linkages between symbols, are you looking at words individually? Are you looking at runs of words and things like that? And how long would you consider a run? And when do you consider runs to end? And when do you consider them to stop? All these things are really sensitive. It depends what language you're doing it in, but all these things will have an effect on what ultimately you call style. So just keep in mind that there are a lot of like technical considerations about the actual methods that you're using when you're doing this. And a thing I find in New Testament scholarship is they sometimes treat stylistic analysis like a skeleton key, one size fits all. And it doesn't work like that in reality. There are nuances to this that some people might not recognize. So just to break down the claim here that I take issue with, just so we are really specific on what we're talking about, is the claim that is often made in New Testament scholarship, and this is specifically critical scholars of the New Testament, is the following: that we can use secondary textual characteristics from a sample of 7 letters written over a very large windows of time And those letters may actually be composites of different parts of other letters. So we can use those 7 letters, which total around 23,000 words, in order to deny attribution or confirm attribution of 6 other letters, which total about 9,000 words, and written over a similar large stretch of time. Before doing this podcast, I found a bunch of other guys who have done the sorts of analysis that I have done, just professionals that I've worked with in the past, and I sent them the specifications for Paul's letters specifically in the New Testament, and I said, hey, I'm working on this problem for a guy I know, and I just want to get your input. And I just described the features of the letters. This one letter has 8,000 words in it, approximately. This is the style. We don't know when it was written. We think it was written within 5 years of this other letter that was written, and it's this long. And I basically gave them that description. And I said, what are the chances that we could use these 7 letters to determine whether or not this other group of 6 letters was written by the author? And every single one of them came back and said, John, we can't do this. Like, you know that this is not really going to be possible, right? You should know better than to ask me this. Anyway, so just to give you a sample of what other professionals who do this work think, when you don't tell them it's the New Testament and you just say, here's the generic problem, here's the bound, here's the scope, here's what we want to do, most of them will come back and say, any conclusions that you come to this will be pretty dubious on their face and should be held in an open hand. Like, you should understand that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and you definitely should not do attribution based on this characteristic alone of just stylistic analysis or extraction, or what we call extraction of secondary features from a text. So, the first question I think we should ask is probably the most important one, which is, are the styles of the letters attributed to Paul actually different? That's probably an interesting thing to establish first before we even get into this. And the answer from my analysis, and I'll let Josiah talk about his in a few seconds, is, well, yes and no, but like, in terms of actually different to a degree that's meaningful, not really. Like, you can make some arguments for some portions, but overall, I would not hang your hat on this analysis. And to say these things are actually meaningfully different in style is a very difficult claim to make using actual computational models of analysis that we know are useful for doing this type of work and that have been proven to actually work. When you take these methods and when you apply them to the texts, from the work I've done, it's sort of like, some parts are stylistically different, but overall there is stylistic coherence between these various letters, and that will depend heavily on a lot of different factors. So Josiah has actually done the more in-depth analysis here, so I'll let him try to explain it. So, are the letters of Paul really stylistically different from each other?
I think even before asking the question about the styles across letters, it's important to look at the question about styles within letters, which is something I alluded to
absolutely.
Earlier, which is that you might have very different styles that occur within a given letter or a given text, whatever the unit of analysis you have. And when I was running my models, I ran different levels of models based on a hyperparameter that was selected in advance of how many Pauline and non-Pauline styles were thought to exist within the corpus being considered. And the corpus being considered, the first subcorpus was just the 13 letters of Paul, and then or those attributed to him, claimed by him. And then the second set it included control books of Hebrews and First John. Hebrews as a bit of an unknown book, and John is definitively not Pauline. And one thing that was intriguing is, depending on how many layers of Pauline styles you chose, you actually got a pretty wide array of or pretty decent distribution of those styles within the 7 undisputed. So my models trained on the 7 undisputed, assuming that those were the only known Pauline works, and then those had only Pauline styles assigned to them. And in the best performing of the models, where there was a theorized 4 Pauline styles and 2 non-Pauline styles, you had 4 styles appearing throughout the 7 undisputed. One of them was the main style, 2 of them were a secondary/tertiary style, and a fourth one, which I think this was the most intriguing. The fourth actually coincided exactly with the ends of all of the letters that have sections of final greetings. Like, you could map on exactly where their classifications began based on when, if you're going through the book, you get to the end and it starts saying greet so and so. You already had 4 styles circulating throughout the 7 undisputed, which right there automatically, I think, puts a damper on the question about other books being of such a different style, because if you have 4 styles already operating within the letters themselves, then what's to say that this letter over here is somehow too different to fit within that? Maybe it has some proportion of those 4 plus a fifth, but does the inclusion of that fifth style, if you already have 4 known or assumed, does that fifth style really have to get written off? That can't be Pauline. Maybe it could be. And in fact, it's probably high likelihood that it is.
Yeah. And so the overall answer to the question is basically they aren't nearly as stylistically different as some New Testament scholars like to say in just terms of stylistic analysis. If you are using methods that are known reliable to do that.
Yeah, I would just summarize the point by saying that the variation within Pauline letters is oftentimes as great, if not greater, stylistically than the variation across letters. So you had similar, just in the final analysis that I had, you had based on how the distribution of the styles worked, you had that those proportions and even sometimes the distributions of where they clustered were often quite varied within an individual letter, but that pattern held across letters. So that tells you something about the nature of the style being considered, that namely that it's not a singular style, but multiple styles that you have to account for. And that just complicates things beyond, I think, the dogmatic claims that a lot of people might like to make.
Yeah, Josiah sent me a great chart that sort of is a breakdown of this that I'll include in the show notes for you to look at exactly what we're talking about so you can better visualize it. And yeah, it's a pretty good breakdown of what it is. And also just it's a good breakdown of what stylistic analysis typically looks like in texts in general. So if you're just looking at not even the New Testament, just basically anyone's writing, that's actually what stylistic analysis looks like and breaks down to look like. It's not these styles match or these don't match. It's a sort of block by block run comparison, and these runs typically match these with this level of certainty. Yeah. Anyway, so it's a good diagram that illustrates what we're looking at. So that's actually where we could potentially end this podcast, but I want to just steelman the opposition and go deeper into the methodologies and say, okay, for fairness sake, let's just concede now that there are meaningful stylistic differences. And these meaningful stylistic differences have a effect on whether or not someone wrote these letters. Let's just take it for granted that stylistic differences do exist. We won't argue. We'll just say, okay, they do, and ask, does this actually matter very much? And how much does this matter? So let's get into that. So we'll just accept, for the sake of argument, again, I think we're both on the same page where we think that the argument for stylistic differences is probably pretty wildly overstated in some places. In some places, I think it's properly stated, but other places, I think it gets blown out of proportion. But let's just, for argument's sake, let's say that. So I'll include another diagram. So this diagram was from a presentation that I used to give in a grad seminar about stylometric analysis. And it's basically a diagram saying, should you use stylometric analysis? And it has an x-axis and a y-axis. On the y-axis is labeled size of known writings, and on the x-axis, it's size of things you are analyzing. And I have color graded it to show the accuracy. And basically, we have 3 colors. Yes, you should use stylistic analysis. It'll work. 2, you can use it, but you're going to create quite a few false positives. And then 3, your results will probably be worse than guessing. So this is my basic premise for just teaching people the basics about Stylo. And one of really important thing to consider is, especially when you're doing statistical analysis, size of your base and size of your target. Do you have enough material in your base to establish long, consistent patterns of things? And then the thing that you're analyzing, does it also have equivalent sets of those long, consistent patterns that could be used for cross comparison? I think that a lot of people hear these arguments in the New Testament. In fact, I don't think it, I know it, because I asked them, why do you think this? And they explain. They have these intuitions that are formed from style and stylistic analysis. And when I've talked to many of my New Testament scholar friends, they've said something fairly similar. And the argument they make is, look, if we look at all these novels that we have novels written by an author, and then maybe the author writes under another pen name. And in these cases, you can look at these things and say, oh, this author, look at how close their style is to this other author that they're writing under their pen name, and look how close they cohere to each other, and look how different it is from all these other authors. Clearly, stylistic analysis works. And it's, you're comparing apples to oranges here. Like in one, we're dealing with interpersonal correspondence from antiquity in small volumes. And here you're dealing with the Harry Potter books, which are a tome. They're a book stop. The differences in sample size, or in base size and target size, are significant enough that you should look at that Stylo chart and just realize you're probably somewhere in the red-yellow of that chart and not in the yellow-green. Just based on that alone. In order for stylistic analysis to be the most accurate, you need large samples. And in most cases in which you'll see, and especially popularizers of New Testament studies. So one example I'm thinking of is a guy named Pauline. He has a video about who wrote the letters of Paul, where he uses examples about J.K. Rowling, George R.R. Martin, and a bunch of other people. And it's, first of all, these are novels. They're not interpersonal correspondences. Those things work very differently from each other. Second of all, very different literary culture you're writing in. I'm not sure that these sorts of things should be compared or can be compared, especially when you're talking about style. And third, wow, the volume is very different from these. And what I'm trying to get at is not that stylistic analysis won't work. It's that the results of stylistic analysis are going to be varied based on these inputs. So something I kept saying last week was forensic reconstruction and historical reconstruction is highly contingent on inputs. This is an example of our inputs, and our inputs are just the volume size of the letters, and are they large enough? In some cases, to do some things, I would say, yeah, they're a sufficient-ish size, but to do firm attribution, or especially, so just by the way, firm attribution is a lot easier to do than attribution denial. To say someone did write something is actually easier to prove than to say someone didn't write something, especially when you're using style. And so I just want to make it really clear, even when we're going into these arguments, even if we grant that these things are stylistically different, we're in a place where because of the volume size, the chances that you will accidentally come to an incorrect conclusion due to insufficient data is higher than if you were to do it on a source that had a sufficient volume.
One thing that we alluded to at the beginning that I think would be relevant here is the question about the methodology, about your assumption of the null hypothesis, whether your actual or de facto null hypothesis that you assume when you go into these sorts of tests. Because depending on what you assume going into the tests that you administer, that will greatly color not only your results, but it may even make certain results impossible. And so in the case of the Pauline letters, one of the problems is that people will approach it, and they'll approach it with an eye of proving that Paul wrote it, because the assumption is that he didn't. I have to prove, everyone says he didn't, so I need to prove that he did. One of the problems with that, though, and I lay this out in my thesis with a proof, that if you start with an unknown set of authors, you have to, in order to reject that null hypothesis, if it has multiple authors, reject all of the individual authors in that null hypothesis before you can make a conclusion about your alternative. So if you have authors A, B, and C, and your choices are it's either A or B on the one hand, or it's author C, you have to show that it's neither A nor B before you can conclude C. And the problem with Paul's letters is we don't have a defined set of other possible authors. It includes all known and unknown theoretical authors of the letters. And the problem there will be no matter what results you get, even if you could somehow test against a bunch of other possible authors for these besides Paul, which we can't because we don't have any other testing material. Even if you could do that, the problem is that whatever stylistic differences you have will always be able to fit a kind of a platonic ideal theoretical author for whom that's an exact match, as opposed to Paul. And that's why you will never, in practice, as well as in the theoretical proof of it, be able to reject that claim that Paul didn't write it. So you have to go in with the assumption that he did, if only because, one, the letters all claim that he did, and two, the fact that you don't have anything else to test it against, and three, if you don't assume that, you can't arrive at anything that's an epistemologically valid conclusion.
So some other points that I think are worth making here. So this is basically from all of my time doing this analysis in the field, checking against primary characteristics of things to validate, is this going to work or is this not going to work? So a primary characteristic would be like you have video evidence of a guy writing a letter, and that guy wrote it because you have a secondary thing outside of the text showing that they did that. The Pauline corpus only has secondary characteristics. It doesn't have any primary characteristics. And primary characteristics are the ones you usually want to use to authenticate texts. And if you came into a modern forensic environment and you said, I'm going to authenticate or deny authentication based on secondary characteristics alone, your analysis would get thrown out. Like, no one would take that seriously. They would be like, you know how frequently these things actually just don't work. I do a lot of forensic auditing, and that is something that I write a lot. It's just like, this isn't actually going to work. Come on. So, as we mentioned before, really important for Stylo that you have lots of data in both your base set that you're training your models on and the sample set that you're analyzing. It is really important that your data has known good sample sets, like known attributed sample sets, which we've just talked about the issues with that. It's really important that the data you're using is of a similar type, that it is being sent to a similar audience, to a similar set of people, because if it's not, that wildly will change the style. So just think about the differences of style that you would write to a friend or personal companion versus your boss. Style changes on those things. And in reality, that's very easily provable. One exercise that I used to do was showing stylistic analysis of my emails and showing that my style changes depending on who I'm writing to. And so knowing who exactly the audience was and the author's relationship to that audience, you want to have those as similar as you possibly can. Other important things to make sure that this will produce good results versus uncertain or false positive, false negatives is knowing how, who, and under what conditions the things were written. So just understanding how the text was composed. Was this written by a guy who was extremely stressed, like texting in the back of his car, like a long message to a friend, or hastily writing off an email at 2 a.m., or were they relaxed on a Saturday, writing correspondence to people? How much sleep did they have? Were they stressed? Were they worried about things? Are they dealing with anxiety? These types of things also impact things.
On that front, the other thing specific to the Pauline corpus, which often is often not factored into the equation, is Paul's known use of amanuenses. But not only his known use of amanuenses, so scribes who help with the writing of the letters, but our own uncertainty 2,000 years later about what role these amanuenses played generally, but then also for each specific author, but also for each specific composition for each specific author. And we can't know this all these years later, and there's evidence to show a wide range of possible practices. So then you have the question, knowing that the process of writing various letters and that these didn't just plop out of the sky one day. Did the Apostle Paul potentially give his amanuensis some bit of leeway, like, hey, just phrase this thing in a certain way or something? It's hard to control for some of those things that go on. And because you can't control for those, you can't just write them out of hand and say, clearly that's an irrelevant factor, when they very well might be a relevant factor. Or if Paul had co-authors, because we know some of his letters, he begins by naming others. And so are these guys, are they just undersigners? Are they contributing their own sections? Is it that Paul writes a section and then they're redacting it or changing it as they go? Those things are unknown to us. And because they're unknown, we have to be really careful about not overstating our conclusions.
Yes. And example, the end of the letter of Romans, the letter writer himself says, I forget his name.
Tertius, yeah.
Also greet you, basically.
Yeah, and in that particular case, I think if I put on my historian hat and take off my statistician hat for just a second, my historian hat and my general human nature tells me that I don't think Paul at that point just looked at Tertius and said, oh, by the way, I need you to write, I, Tertius, write this greeting in my own hand. It's probably, oh, and by the way, Tertius, sign off from here. And then Tertius takes over and just go, okay, I, Tertius, write this, hands it to Paul. Paul looks, yep, looks good. And they send it off. So those are the sorts of behaviors that we don't have a means to account for. And because you can't account for it, you can't state things dogmatically.
And one really interesting thing from the modern era of me doing this analysis is I know that it is pretty reliable using stylistic analysis to differentiate between a person who voice dictates something and who manually types it on a keyboard. These things have different styles. And they have pretty distinct styles as well. And again, we don't actually know how these letters were created. We don't know how they were composed. We don't have any of that data. And so all of that just brings in levels of uncertainty and should pretty widely increase your confidence intervals. Now, one of the biggest things that I cannot emphasize enough how important this is knowing the time of correspondence. So in the modern world, we typically call these deltas. So deltas are the time between correspondence and the time between messages. This affects style hugely. So if you have short deltas, stylometric analysis is going to be a lot more determinative of whether or not this is going to produce good results. If you have short time periods between the writings, and when I mean short, I mean like days, weeks. And this is, just think about it yourself. And again, you could do this on your own emails. I encourage you to do it on your own emails. It's an interesting exercise, or go through your own DMs on social media and just look at how you wrote 5 years ago versus how you're writing now and do some preliminary analysis on it. You're going to find that there are differences because people are mimetic creatures that copy each other and copy the behaviors of the people around them, and that changes the way that you express yourself in writing. And if you don't know the time between letters, the chances that you are going to be able to properly authenticate them or improperly authenticate them go down pretty significantly, because these are all confounding variables. And so when you look at stylometric analysis, you need to ask yourself, do I have all these conditions in place? And when I said at the beginning of this podcast, I asked my friends to just give me some feedback, most of them asked me questions like, okay, do we know when these letters were written? I was like, no, we have no idea. We think they were written-ish these amount of years apart, but a lot of those things are based on internal analysis of the text and not an external referent to the actual time that they were written. And they all looked at me like, you can't be serious. You're not actually asking me to do this. We don't know the time between the letters. How are you expecting us to get good data from this or good results? And so when you're asking yourself, okay, even if there are stylistic differences, are these conditions that would lead to good analysis actually in place to begin with? And the answer is not really. And so, especially like you said about the null hypothesis, when you're trying to show this was actually written by a different person, when you have all these other confounding factors, this seriously affects the way that you do analysis.
one thing here, I use this quote in my thesis, a quote by C.S. Lewis in an essay that he delivered at Cambridge on biblical text criticism. And I'm going to butcher the quote, unfortunately, but the gist of it is that he says, for critics today to think that they know more than about the context, the language, everything of some text that was written 2,000 years ago than those who received it first. He said, you have to think that they're almost superhuman to have that ability, because we don't know even what we don't know. And it's those unknown unknowns that ultimately are the big problem. And this is one thing that I think is encountered less so with the pastoral epistles, which at least in my analysis with the whole Pauline corpus, Second Timothy came out as largely indistinguishable from the seven undisputed. First Timothy and Titus were predominantly this secondary and tertiary style, which showed up in places in the main Pauline corpus. I didn't dive in to see, are these somehow tracking with something specifically, but they were dominantly the secondary and tertiary style. This supposedly non-Pauline style showed up in the beginnings of Second Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians, which are the Deutero-Paulines, which are disputed. But what was curious is that they all showed up only in the first halves, and they all cut off at like the same sort of fulcrum points in the letters where Paul shifts from indicative to imperative. So in Romans, this isn't one of those books that pivoted this way, but like how Romans 12:1, you get, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, and you start to get all these commands. These letters did the exact same thing, and you could see that the posterior probabilities of the non-Pauline style start to drop, and then all of a sudden it pivots on a dime to look like everything else that we have known to be or not disputed to be by Paul. And I kept thinking, what could be a possible explanation here? One of the possible explanations is that a book, especially like Ephesians, you have a very high rhetorical tone in which some scholars think Paul's trying to use this particular Asiatic style because it's maybe a circular letter. But the whole point is that something we just don't know. And so you have to say, we don't know what could be causing this, but it maps on really clearly to subject matter breaks. That seems like a better explanation than just throwing the author out, especially because we have so much other evidence to say that it is the same author. And so it's those unknown unknowns that will kill you if you try to overstate your claim and really keep forcing you back to that null hypothesis, even if it's a loosely held null hypothesis. You don't have anything else.
Yeah, and so I want to make it clear. Not only do we have unknown unknowns, we also have known unknowns, right? There are a lot of things we know that we need that we don't really have, and there are a lot of things that we just don't even know that we don't know about all of these sorts of things. So again, your confidence in the ability to either authenticate or inauthenticate a letter based on these characteristics should not be like it's an interesting exercise in speculation. End of sentence. Like that is what you're doing here. You're not determining truth. You are doing interesting analyses. Another thing to add, in the real world, we do not use Stylo as an attribution tool. So Stylo is super useful. It is one of the best tools. The use of Stylo in the modern world is a sieve. The use of Stylo is to pare down a data set from 5 terabytes to a few gigabytes. That is its best use, to take huge unknown texts or unknown compilations of various people and then narrow it down to a few options. And the reason it's used as a sieve and not a tool is because it will frequently have false positives, where it will say these two things are related when they're not, and it will frequently have false negatives, even under really good conditions. And a false positive is saying this person wrote this thing, or these two authors are related when they're not, or a false negative is saying these two authors are not related when they're in fact from the same one. So one way that stylometric analysis is used very frequently in the modern world is for unmasking anonymous accounts. So people have anon accounts and you want to figure out who they are. Stylo is not used to actually tell you this is that person. What it's used for is to narrow down your field of candidates from a potential 30,000 to maybe 400. And then after you've narrowed it down to those 400, then you do much more computationally intensive techniques on just that limited set of 400. That is its actual use. That's its actual use case. Generally speaking, in the field, if I got a report across my desk that I needed to audit and it said, we use stylometric analysis to confirm authorship, I would have a field day because I would be able to basically go through and go, you are absolutely wrong. This is bad analysis. You can't do that. And I could do case study after case study and then like actually prove it with code to show this doesn't work the way that you think it works. And you should use this as a useful tool, but that's it. And so the next question is, yeah, but if you can use it as a sieve, doesn't that at least increase probability of it being written by that person? And the answer is yes, but by how much? And the but by how much is largely contingent on all these other known unknowns and unknown unknowns that we've been talking about, and how much you can control for all these things. And so, yeah, it does increase probability, but by how much is what you need to ask, right? Like in analysis, we say, so what? And that's what you really need to answer.
Yeah, and because especially in the case of New Testament letters, just like anything, you have the internal evidence, which is what we're talking about with stylostatistics, but you have the external evidence. And the external evidence often just gets thrown out the window when we're talking about style. And these two have to balance each other, because if you have a ton of external evidence supporting the idea that someone is the author of something, and then you have some perhaps dissonant, but more often than not just vague or uncertain internal evidence and stylostatistical evidence, you can't just say the vague and uncertain stuff that we have on internal just completely trumps external evidence. It counts for nothing. And that's what you're talking about. It's these external verifiers and verifications that have to be brought to bear. And it's how you weight them. If the external evidence is pretty light, then you can't weight it that much. But if it's a lot, if it's very heavy, so to speak, then the stylo evidence might not actually move the needle that much.
Yeah. And so in the case of the New Testament, I'll just be very clear. I don't think it moves the needle at all. Or if it does, it would move the needle so little that I would basically just be like, whatever. Like, this is essentially not an argument worth pursuing, is what I would talk about. So just to go over a list of, this is a non-exhaustive list, by the way. This is just a list of things that I know are going to change your writing style because we have pretty good evidence to show them. So things like stress, your sleep. Did you get a new social group? Did you move places? That changes your writing style. The social status that you have compared to the other people that you're addressing. The time between your writing. The verbal, are you verbally dictating things or are you handwriting them? Is someone editing your stuff? Is there a sense of urgency? Considerations about rhetorical tone and the reason that you're trying to write it. Are you asking someone to do something when they don't have to, or are you telling them to do something when they have to? Lots of political factors get mixed into this. So not just your relation to people, but do you think you're being watched? Do you think other people are watching you? Do you have to have considerations for thinking, what if this falls into other people's hands? All these things greatly affect style. Your mood will change things. The time of day will change things. Whether you're writing the letter while you're hungry will change things. And there are all these other factors, right? And most importantly, all those factors I just listed, we don't know any of them about how these texts were composed. We don't know. We can't tell you what the conditions were that they wrote these on.
With that, some of the things you listed were things I looked at in my thesis, or at least considered. And two of them in particular were the fact that the pastoral epistles, which was the main focus, are written to individuals, which all the other Pauline letters, except for Philemon, are not written to individuals. They're written to corporate churches, sometimes even multiple churches across cities. And then the second thing is that the pastoral epistles have always felt a bit different in terms of their content, and not just felt different, been different, because you get these detailed instructions from Paul to an apostolic delegate, subordinate, whatever, bishop, whatever you want to call him. And that's something that's unique. And the pastorals have always defied genre expectations for what might be going on. And there's one scholar, Luke Timothy Johnson, who wrote that he thought 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus, but especially 1st Timothy and Titus, were examples of this genre that he called the mandata principis, the commands of the ruler. And it was about a superior writing to a subordinate with instructions about how to carry out affairs. And it was a bit of a tenuous idea because there's not too much in the ancient literature that would fit this category. But anecdotally, when I ran the model here, those letters came out, 1st Timothy and Titus came out tied together largely with this secondary and tertiary styles. And the handful of places in the 7 Undisputed where this stuff showed up were in places that had a lot of instruction seemingly for churches. Like in 1 Corinthians, I think 1 Corinthians 11 through 12 had a high concentration of this stuff. And that's where Paul's giving instructions about head coverings, the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, that kind of stuff. So we already know from, like you said, in the modern world, these things change things. There are changed styles. In the ancient world, there's no less reason to think that they change styles too. And that's generally been the thing I found very deficient in a lot of explanations, is that we know these things to hold true in 2025. But for some reason, because it's the Bible, all of those things we know to be true obviously have to be thrown out the window because we're talking about the Bible.
And here's another. So if you want to prove this for yourself, there are 2 case studies that I know work for this, just to demonstrate to you. So one of them is the exercise I used to assign to grad students, which is the letters of T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia. Basically, he wrote a lot of letters, and you can see all these factors changing things. And if, let's say, you just go through his entire corpus and you randomly select letters from his corpus, and then you do stylistic analysis on a group of randomly selected ones against another group of randomly selected ones, you're going to come out with all sorts of differences depending on which ones get randomly selected. And another factor is we don't know how many letters Paul actually wrote. He could have wrote more letters to other churches, right? We don't know if those exist. We don't know if we have a full sampling of his letters, or if the sampling that survived is just the sample that survived. Like, it is conceivable to me that Paul wrote more times than just 13 times, and we don't have anything outside that. So we don't actually know about our sampling rates. And so if you just replicate selected sampling over a large corpus, over a large amount of time, in other modern contexts, you will come out with similar conclusions. T.E. Lawrence didn't write this, and it's not, no, he wrote that. He was just writing that in the middle of a very intense campaign, and he was probably really tired when he was writing this. And there are all sorts of things like this that you really have to consider. Another thing is, look at early J.K. Rowling versus late J.K. Rowling in her essays and personal correspondence that we have, and the things that she wrote in terms of the style, the topics that she tends to talk about, the open letters that she's written, the essays that she's written, the speeches that she's given. Just compare J.K. Rowling in 2010 to 2025, and you will notice there are some pretty abrupt changes. If you just look at 2010 versus 2025, you'll notice some abrupt changes in the types of things that she talks about, the styles that she uses to talk about things, and themes that she's concerned with in the modern era versus previous eras. Like you said, I don't know why we would say these things don't apply to the ancient world. And I think it's like the burden's on you to show why they don't apply. And there should be a, while I don't expect a one-to-one consistency, because there are other factors, right? Like, we live in a highly literate culture. They didn't live in a highly literate culture. So maybe that affects things. But at the same time, and scribal practice different then than it is now, those things can affect them. But also, what about all these other factors? And what about all these other modern examples?
Yeah, I think there's a term that was coined by Michael Crichton, the Jurassic Park author, and it was called Gell-Mann amnesia, which he describes as the phenomenon where people, notably experts, will read, say, an article in a newspaper that's in their field, and they'll just spot all the problems with it and see, oh, that's wrong. But then they flip the page and they read another article that's outside their field, and they're completely credulous about everything that they read. And they, look, I just read it over here. And that seems to happen a lot with this sort of problem, that we have if, like you said, if you presented this problem to your friends and they're saying, there's no way we can solve this, this is not possible, what are you talking about? But then the moment that you move it out of the realm of modern stylostatistical analysis to the Bible, all of a sudden, then all of the holes that we would spot in this kind of analysis, and whether it be for courtroom or national defense, something like that, all of those problems that we would spot here, we don't spot over with the Bible because of the Bible. And like I said, somehow it gets a pass on all of these other things.
Yeah. And just like what I want to encourage people is, you're reading skeptical New Testament studies. Maybe you should be skeptical of those skeptical studies. Apply your skepticism evenly across the board. And I think when you actually take a lot of these things that you read and apply the technical rigor that you need to apply, things aren't going to be nearly as clear as you would like them to be. Like there are just so many issues that we've just briefly covered and that we've just briefly touched on, where you add those things and you ask, okay, is this analysis that you've done actually sound? Is it methodologically solid? Are the conclusions that you're coming to conclusions that I would want to take to the bank, or that I would want to put a high degree of trust in? And I fully bought into the skeptical New Testament scholarly positions when I first read them, like when I was 19, 20, and I thought, yeah, these seem really convincing. These seem accurate. And it was only after I actually got into this field where I started doing this actual work. I didn't even think of applying it to the New Testament until one time I was with a friend, and the friend said an argument about why Paul didn't write a letter. And I was like, I recognize that style of argument. That's a terrible argument. Like, that doesn't work in the real life. And then I started applying those techniques to these methodologies, and I just went, oh, I think I just didn't know enough to evaluate the soundness of the criteria they were using. But now that I can, I think it is, to put it lightly, dubious at best. You need to show your methodologies that actually work. And a lot of the time, the methodologies that do work will not work under these conditions. And a lot of the time that I read stylistic arguments, like you said, they're either on like English translations of the Bible, or they are not using statistical techniques that are actually going to produce good results on any data set if you apply them. And in terms of, do these things change probabilities, I would basically say maybe slightly. But if they do change probabilities, I don't think the argument is in favor of different authorships. Like, in the amount that they do change probabilities, I don't think you're getting a great case for these were written by different people.
Oh yeah, I laid out two criteria. They were two necessary criteria that needed to be met in this testing methodology in order to reject Pauline authorship of a book. And the criteria were that, number one, the unit of analysis was sentence. I had parts of speech transition, so it was words, but it looked at words to comprise sentence classifications. And it was that a majority of a book's sentences had to be classified as non-Pauline. And it's not because 51% is magical. It's just because it's an easy number to work with. Saying a majority, it puts it in a nice class. That a majority of the sentences had to be non-Pauline. And then the second, which was the really more important criteria, was that there remains no theory with strong explanatory power that still assumes the null hypothesis of Pauline authorship to explain the result that you got in number one. And then you would be at more liberty to say, Paul didn't, maybe it's that unknown category. So, well, maybe he didn't, maybe it's even likely that he didn't, but at the very least, we could say that the null is wrong. Or reject the null hypothesis. What was intriguing is that the pastorals didn't come out that way for sure. They came out as pretty Pauline. Definitively so. It was those first halves of Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians that came out as non-Pauline, but only Ephesians was a majority, and Ephesians actually had the strongest subject matter dependency. So that's the sort of thing that I think often just will be overlooked, because people will jump to some conclusion based on an initial look at the layout of stuff. Like, it might be, for instance, with Ephesians, it's always a comment about, look at how long the sentences are, abnormally long for the rest of Paul's writings. Well, but when you condition those long sentences across books that have that, you find that actually it's just that style is really just a product of the long sentences. If you broke up those sentences, you would actually get some different styles going on than you would if you just let them entire as one sentence writ large. So those are the sort of small considerations that will get overlooked. And that it can seem superficial at first glance to say, oh, Ephesians has a lot longer sentences. But what if I also told you they all clustered in the exact same part of the book, and then they abruptly went back to the expected average sentence length at the same point as all the other letters did? Those are the sorts of considerations that you have to take into account.
Yeah, and so like my overall analysis specifically of stylistic arguments in Paul is to basically say, look, we don't have enough data or the type of data that we would need to make really strong pronouncements about these letters. And especially, we do not have the data that would allow us to say these were written by different people. The number of different factors that we actually need that would allow us to determine them simply aren't there. And the amount of known unknowns and unknown unknowns that we cannot control for are so numerous that any pronouncements that we make should be held with an open hand and kept. Don't hold these conclusions too tightly, because these are not conclusions that you could take home to the bank or that I would suggest you put any serious stake in. What this is, just from an analytical perspective, these are interesting things to think about. They are not like reality determining or methods that I would risk anything on, basically. I would basically just say, this is an interesting thing to think about. And at the end of the day, the characteristics that we have from the text don't allow us to either authenticate them or deny authentication. They're just like what you should say from just a strictly analytical perspective is, I don't know. Because the analytics simply will not produce a strong enough methodological result that will allow you to extract the types of conclusions that you want to extract. Anything else to add?
The most that I think, or rather the worst case scenario based on the research that I did, is that the worst case scenario is that you would say these are not inconsistent with Pauline authorship, which you're not claiming that they are, but you're saying they're not inconsistent with that. That's really the most that you could push the claim of Pauline authorship off the table, is to say these aren't inconsistent with it, but we're not saying it is Paul. Really, your options are either, the null hypothesis of Pauline authorship, or they're not inconsistent with it, but we can't say anything beyond that, which is a much narrower bound and much more certain on the side of Pauline authorship, in fact, bound than what you would get in a lot of skeptical scholarship.
And I just want to make it clear, the skeptical scholarship does not hinge on stylistic argumentation. For some of the letters, it does. Like for some of the letters, stylistic, like the Deutero-Pauline letters, rely on stylistic arguments. So Colossians, Ephesians, and Second Thessalonians, those do rely pretty heavily in most cases on stylistic arguments. And so I would basically say maybe don't take those as seriously. But the essential arguments that the critical side put together, I will try to do my best to give. If I were trying to make their case, this is the case that I would make on their behalf. And the case is this. We don't know who wrote the books in the New Testament, because that data about who wrote them that we would need to know simply isn't there. We don't know how they were composed. There are all these unknown unknowns and known unknowns. The attribution that we have to Paul is based on self-identification in the letters, which is not particularly strong, and then confluences of church tradition, which, if you're just going from a strictly forensic perspective, not the case that you can use those characteristics to authenticate a letter. We know that Christians were producing pseudoepigraphy, so we know that there's a 3 Corinthians, for example, and there are other letters that are said to be written by Paul that identify themselves as Paul. So we do know that those were there in the at least 2nd century. We know that Christians disputed texts and disputed letters and the letters and their authenticity. And we know from various different canon lists that we have from the early church that they do not always include all 13 letters. Given that they don't include all 13 of these letters, we can determine that perhaps one of the reasons that these letters were left out is because the original people in the early church did not think they were authentically Pauline. Because the process by which the early church analyzed texts was they weren't doing forensic authentication, like they weren't doing detailed statistical analysis or anything like that of these letters, because they were mostly relying on tradition and other factors to determine these things. The reason that they included all 13 letters in the texts are not as rigorous as we normally would like them to be. And so it is possible that letters attributed to Paul were written by people who weren't Paul, but then authenticated by the church as having been written by Paul and included in the canon. Because we don't have any of these things, we don't have provenance, we don't have chain of custody, we don't have any other methods of authenticating these texts with primary characteristics, we can say that there are potentially good reasons to suspect that some of the letters weren't actually written by Paul. That is the best case that I could make. But even then, that case is not a particularly good one, because let's go to the canon lists. Why didn't the early church include all the books in some of their canon lists? Do we know that they had them? Do we know that they were all disputing them? In some cases, we see people disputing them, saying this is the reason that we don't have the Apocalypse of Peter in, or something like that. We know there were disputes about these books, but like, I don't know, were they using good criteria to accept or reject these books? How were they determining this? And so basically, the best argument you can make for some of them being forgeries are, we know Christians made forgeries, and we know the process by which things were included in the canon were not as rigorous as we would like them to be by modern standards. And so it's possible that one of these forgeries was accidentally authenticated by the church. That's about as rigorous of a case as I could make in the steelman position. I would basically say any arguments that use stylistic analysis or try to argue about things based on style are not great. Especially when you also look at things like assumed development. I don't think those are particularly good arguments because, again, what do we know about these communities that Paul was writing to? Not a whole lot, right? Like there, in the pastorals, for example, there are references to developed church hierarchy. Bishops and things like that are referenced in those pastoral epistles. But again, I don't know, maybe they just had those things. Maybe they had a church culture that allowed them to develop a structure, or maybe they necessarily needed a structure where the other ones didn't. There are so many unknown unknowns that you can deal with. And like the argumentation for why these aren't authentic gets circular when you're using secondary characteristics to just internally assess. Final thoughts on this. When you are listening to critical scholars talk to lay audiences about authentication in the Pauline corpus, I would say hold their conclusions with an open hand, and especially when they're talking about style, understand that the arguments they're making are not particularly strong. It's just the way it is. I wish we could make better arguments for things. We can't. We have the data that we have, and the data doesn't really lend itself to this. I used to find these arguments extremely compelling because I didn't actually understand the methods that they applied. Once I understood them, I became very disillusioned with the certainty at which these conclusions were made. And I just think that sort of skepticism of skeptical scholarship should be actively applied to the findings of critical scholars as well, right? Be critical of their methods just as they are critical of the methods of the early church. Now, final parting thoughts. What do I think? So I have a running joke on the podcast of I think whatever you think, but I won't do that in this situation. I basically think that if you accept that Paul wrote all the letters in that are attributed to him, that's a completely reasonable and rational conclusion to come to, given the evidence that we have. It's still not a finding that I would push on other people and say, you must accept this because the evidence is overwhelming. Because it's not. However, you are rational and justified if you believe that Paul actually wrote these letters that are attributed to him. You can do that with sound pretenses. What I don't think is a particularly strong conclusion is Paul did not write these letters. If you say, I think Paul wrote these letters, or we don't know who wrote these letters, I think those conclusions are reasonably sound. The conclusions that I wouldn't agree are reasonably sound are Paul didn't write these letters. Because what you would need to prove that, and like exactly what you were saying, Josiah, about the null hypothesis, there are conditions that need to be set for you to show that. And I don't think you can come to those. If your position is it's possible Paul didn't write some of those letters, sure, whatever, like that is a reasonable conclusion to come to. But also coming to the conclusion that Paul wrote all these letters, and I think it's justified to accept that, perfectly reasonable, using the data that we have available. Any other thoughts, Josiah, before we shut it down here?
No, nothing particularly. I think just in general, people, like you said, be skeptical of the skeptics, because just because they're skeptics doesn't mean they deserve any less scrutiny than those who are making the claims of, say, authenticity for the letters. And one of the things that really helped me through my research process was the thought that everybody needs to prove their case and make their case and make the decisions of who you think is right and wrong based on the evidence and the argument, even if that answer ends up being really obvious. That whatever the answer is, you need to pursue it with inquiry, and that sometimes the truth isn't discovering something new, but recovering something old, even if you happen to use new methods to find it. And that's what I think stylostatistics has allowed us to do in the modern world. It's allowed us to use new methods to look at old claims that might have been right all along.
Do you have anything you would like to plug before we sign off?
No, particularly nothing. Thanks for having me on.
Is your thesis going to be published anywhere that we would have access to it?
It is published at least through the university database. I'll see about having it uploaded somewhere more publicly, though.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I will see you guys all next week for a completely different topic unrelated to stylometric analysis in the Pauline corpus. My name's John. If you want to email me, you can email me christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can find me on Blue Sky at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. If you'd like to join the Discord, you can send me an email and I'll give you a link, or message me on one of those platforms. Gladly provide you a link. If you would like to buy any specific podcast related merch, I'll leave a link in the description. All the proceeds will go to the artists that created them. Yeah, like this, comment, subscribe, do all the things for the algorithm. And that is all. See you later.